Hey guys, my name is Wayne and I'm a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, and I just want to tell you guys that Moses did not write the Torah. So a lot of us grew up believing that Moses wrote the Torah, and honestly, nobody really specifically told us that Moses wrote the Torah, but I think a lot of people grew up with the King James Bible, and when you open up the King James Bible, it'll say Genesis, the first book of Moses. And so people would just immediately assume that Moses wrote the Torah. Well, ever since textual criticism and biblical scholarship being upcoming in the 1940s, biblical scholars have come to the unanimous conclusion, unanimous decision that the Hebrew Bible was not written by one person, being Moses, whoever you think wrote it. The Hebrew Bible was written by multiple people over a long period of time. Christians say 40, but no, maybe even hundreds of hands have touched the Bible, writing styles changing hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible. So the unanimous decision, though, across the board is that the Bible wasn't written by one person. Moses did not write the Torah. Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible. And I'm going to go over how we know this. So when you read Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 talks about the creation of the world and et cetera, et cetera. And what a lot of people don't know about Genesis chapter 1 is that Genesis chapter 1, among most scholars, including myself, is dated back to the Babylonian exile. A lot of us don't know about the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile happened in 596 BCE. And in 596 BCE, that is when the Babylonians sieged Jerusalem. They sacked Jerusalem. They destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and they took the Israelites as captors into the land of Babylon. And when the Israelites were in Babylon, they were in captivity there in Babylon for 70 years. So when you look at Genesis chapter 1 specifically, when you look at Genesis, the very second verse of Genesis uses a Babylonian cognate. When it says, "And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep." That word that's used for deep, when it says God hovered over the face of the deep, or God hovered over, in some of your Bibles, it'll say the face of the waters. That Hebrew word used is tehom, and tehom is a cognate. It is a sister word of a sister language from Akkadian. Now, Akkadian is a form of Babylonian, and the cognate of tehom is Tiamat. Now, Tiamat is the name of a Babylonian dragon. So what you have happening in Genesis chapter 1, when it says the Spirit of God hovered over the face of Tehom, is better understood as the Spirit of God hovered over the face of Tiamat, meaning that Genesis 1 is giving you this idea of God or Yahweh, Elohim, conquering a Babylonian god. So then you start having new questions come up. Like, if Moses wrote Genesis 1, why is Moses using Babylonian cognates? Moses is an Egyptian, right? Moses would have been an Egyptian prince. So why is Moses using Babylonian words, Babylonian cognates? And why is Moses, who is Egyptian, why is he writing a story about Yahweh conquering a Babylonian god? Well, the answer would be Moses isn't writing about Yahweh conquering a Babylonian god. And Moses isn't using Hebrew that has Akkadian cognates and Babylonian loanwords. Moses isn't writing this. Whoever is writing this lived way after Moses in the Babylonian captivity. So that is one of many evidences to show that the book of Genesis wasn't written by Moses, but the book of Genesis was written, Genesis chapters 1 to 11 at least, were written during the Babylonian captivity. There's Babylonian cognates, there's Babylonian loanwords. The text is Babylonian themed with Babylonian polemics against Babylonian gods. So maybe whoever wrote the text was in Babylon and surrounded by Babylonian deities and Babylonian people. Now, something else that biblical scholars have noticed is when you read Genesis 1 and when you read Genesis 2, they are, in fact, two different creation stories indefinitely. So this takes us into talking about something called the documentary hypothesis. Now, what the documentary hypothesis is it is a hypothesis that was first proposed by a guy named Julius Wellhausen in 1878. And what Julius Wellhausen proposed is that the Bible wasn't just written by one person, but it seems like the Bible was written by different persons or different people. So there were four different sources that make up what we call the Hebrew Bible, right? So basically, it's called the documentary hypothesis because document is singular and documentary can be plural. So what Julius Wellhausen proposed is that the Bible is not one single document, but that the Bible is made up of documentaries or documents, plural. And so those documents are split up into four different sources. So there are four hypothetical sources that make up the documentary hypothesis, and those sources are known as JEPD. So J stands for the Yahweh source, E stands for the Elohim source, P stands for the priestly source, and D stands for the Deuteronomist. Now, these letters, these stand for the sources. These are not people, these are sources, these are texts. And when scholars look through the Hebrew Bible, they categorize certain chapters or even verses in the Bible to different sources. I'll give you guys an example. So Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they are made up of two sources. So Genesis 1 was written by the Elohist, and Genesis 2 was written by the Yahwist. So when you read Genesis chapter 1, Genesis 1 uses uses the title Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. But then when you get to Genesis chapter 2, Genesis 2 uses the personal name Yahweh, or it'll say Yahweh Elohim. So Genesis 1 is attributed to the Elohimist, and Genesis 2 is attributed to the Yahwist. And some scholars actually attribute Genesis 1 to the priestly source because Genesis 1 deals with priestly things. Like Genesis 1, the world is made in 7 days, like the Sabbath over in the book of Exodus. So when you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, these look like they were written by two different people. Genesis 1 simply uses the title Elohim. Genesis 2 used the title Yahweh. But even more, Genesis 1, how does God make things in Genesis 1? In Genesis 1, Yahweh makes things with his voice. But when you read Genesis chapter 2, God doesn't make Adam with his voice. God doesn't make Eve with his voice. He makes Adam and Eve with his hands. And he's walking with Adam in the cool of the garden. So in Genesis 1, the title of Elohim is used, and God isn't personal in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 gives you a very impersonal God doing things kind of hands off with his voice, like a king. And Genesis 2 has God being up close and personal with people, with Adam and Eve. And so they give you two different views of God, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 gives you a very impersonal view of God, and Genesis 2 gives you a very personal view of God, even to the fact where the author of Genesis chapter 2, he's going out his way to show the audience that God is personal by using God's personal name.